Salam, everyone. Thank you for those of you who have joined us. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes. We're going to assume some people are starting on Muslim time. So yeah, we'll be starting very shortly. And you get to enjoy our faces in the meantime. Amazing. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this moment of crisis. I think what's really important about this panel today about the war on terror and the legacy of the war on terror is that these moments are always timely, unfortunately. This would have been timely a year ago, this would have been timely 2 years ago, and unfortunately, it will probably be timely again in a year. This panel is going to be about the archive and legacy of US state violence specifically, how it also continues to shape collective memory within the Muslim community and beyond. So we're going to hear a lot about surveillance, counterterrorism, and different also interventions and tactics that those of us on the panel, or this esteemed panel, has all been working on throughout years and years and years. So we're so excited to learn from them and learn alongside them. So if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to share them in the comments. There'll be time at the end to be able to get through as many as possible. If it's a clarifying question, we'll try to bring it up right at that same moment, but we will try to save some time at the end. I'll just say a few really quick words just before we dive in. I think right now, with over 40,000 Palestinians who have been massacred in Gaza and continuous policing, surveillance, militarism of settlers across the West Bank, it is just heartbreaking to be able to watch all of that and also understand the legacy of the United States in crafting these policies, setting up the logic, setting the stage, and ongoing collaborations between the United States and Israel. And so we're holding that in this space and recognizing that so much of what we're talking about today is actually so directly related to both the United States' repression of ongoing protests across the country, as well as the logics that are fueling and enabling genocide that's actively happening right now. The war on terror is an all-encompassing culture. It is the laws, it's the departments, it's the timelines that we're going to go through, and it also is a holistic culture. And it looks like, you know, states, countries not batting an eye when 40,000 people who look like us are massacred. But suddenly, you know, all hell will break loose if a white student hears a phrase like "from the river to the sea" on a college campus. The war on terror also looks like blurred lines between the military and the police, and a sort of militarized individual person that we've also seen happening on college campuses across the country in response to very simple demands of not wanting to be complicit in genocide. And so just to situate us before we dive into this panel is to remember that, you know, the war on terror has a history in the United States, and a lot of like the formal war on terror begins in the timeline of this website that we'll be viewing, and that Muslim Counterpublics Lab have put together so beautifully and has such a rich archive of material that is such a gift for all of us who are doing work in and around the war on terror. But also that it's built on logics of anti-Blackness, it's a vestige of slavery, and inherent within this is a process of disciplining and controlling bodies in a manner that fits the need of empire. So the war on terror is the language that we have now used, starting from 9/11, but it is so much deeper than that and has so many more sort of vestiges that has come from and will continue to kind of proliferate in different ways. So we're going to see all those different types of ways that the war on terror appears in our communities, both domestically and abroad. And then, what can we do about it? What is being done about it? How can we actually look back, gaze back, build timelines, make visible what is so erased and hidden? So yes, turning over to our amazing panel. First and foremost, we have Dr. Maha Hilal, who is a Muslim Arab American and an expert on institutionalized Islamophobia, the war on terror, and counter-narrative work. Dr. Hilal is the founding executive director of Muslim Counterpublics Lab, an organization that works to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. Sophia Khalid is the staff attorney in the MLFA's Federal Criminal Defense Department, where she represents individuals unjustly charged with national security-related crimes during counterterrorism investigations, at trial, on appeal, and in post-conviction matters in federal courts across the country. Mursil Sabir is a San Diego native with international aspirations, a project coordinator for Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, and co-founder of Afghans Empowered. With an MA in International Relations, Mursil currently directs Swana Region Studies at the Center for International Relations and International Security. And finally, Nicole Wynn is an associate professor of criminology, law, and justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research draws on and contributes to grassroots struggles challenging racialized policing, war, and empire. Thank you all so much for making the time to share all of your brilliance with us today. Before we dive in, we have a quick video that outlines the goals and the purposes of the timeline that has been put together by the Counterpublics Lab, and then we'll pass it over to Dr. Maha Hilal.
My name is Dr. Maha Hilal, and I'm the Executive Director of the Muslim Counterpublics Lab. I'd like to welcome you to Shattering Justice and Remaking the Muslim Threat, a virtual 3D exhibition. Each year in the United States, on the anniversary of 9/11, we are urged to never forget the victims of the attacks in 2001. Their memories are uplifted not just on the anniversary, but throughout the year through memorials, museums, and events. There are stories and memories, however, that are not included in these platforms, and in many cases intentionally excluded, namely of Muslim and Muslim American victims targeted in the aftermath, and as a direct result of the 9/11 attacks and the never-ending war on terror that was launched on September 20th, 2001. The idea for this exhibition was born out of the desire to construct and preserve historical memory of the violence that the US's war on terror has systematically wrought on Muslim and Muslim American communities across the globe. In curating this exhibition, we focused on identifying pivotal laws, policies, and significant events post 9/11 through Muslim eyes, voices, and experiences that have resulted in monumental levels of Muslim suffering. Leveraging powerful imagery, the exhibition chronicles the war on terror for each year that has been in existence, creating a foundation to conceptualize and construct the totality of the war's impact on Muslims. While it is meant to be as comprehensive as possible, it is an ongoing project, not only because the war's end remains nebulous, but because of how much secrecy has surrounded it. It is our hope that this exhibition will serve as a robust political educational tool that will continue to be a resource long after, and hopefully when the war on terror is dismantled and abolished. This exhibition was inspired by and created for the pursuit of justice for Muslims, justice that is long past due. I want to thank all the collaborators that made this exhibition possible, including Rise Together Fund that provided significant financial support for this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Maha Halal, would you like to give an introduction and continue to explain what we just saw and talk more about this amazing exhibition that you all put together?
Thank you so much, Huda, for the introduction. Thank you to all of our incredible panelists for being here today. As it happens, today the jury could not come to a decision in the case of El Shimari versus Kaki, which was a civil suit brought on behalf of 3 Iraqi plaintiffs who were tortured at Abu Ghraib by the Center for Constitutional Rights. The trial started on April 15th and was in jury deliberations for the past 8 days. And again, it was just announced that it would be it's a mistrial because there was not a unanimous decision. And so I mention this because what happened at Abu Ghraib happened, or at least was exposed, in 2004. In fact, this past Sunday was the 20-year anniversary of when the pictures of the horrific torture were first revealed on CBS's 60 Minutes. You know, I was talking to a friend a few days ago, and I told her I was writing a couple of pieces about Abu Ghraib. And she didn't know what I was talking about. She's 32. And of course, you know, some people that are 32 might know what Abu Ghraib is. Some people that are older might not know what Abu Ghraib is. Some people that are younger don't know about Abu Ghraib. But the important point here is that we need to understand and we need to uplift the legacy of the war on terror. Because the violence that the United States has inflicted on so many of our communities is important to remember. And it's important to understand because of where we are today, right? It's not an accident as to why this violence continues. And when we think about, just using my friend as one example, why it is that she didn't know about Abu Ghraib, we can attribute this to the ways in which the US government, right, has tried to coerce amnesia onto the American population so that we forget all of these painful parts, horrific parts of American history. And we can't even say it's properly history because the violence continues and evolves. So I wanted to create this timeline of the war on terror for a couple of reasons. It's a project that began about 6 or 7 years ago to really show the trajectory of the war on terror, to understand how the targeting began and where we are now, to connect what was happening domestically with what was happening internationally, and to really think about producing an archive from a Muslim lens that would paint a different picture of what the war on terror has been for our community. So this timeline, this exhibit, is about reckoning and justice. If we don't know the history, we can't demand justice. It's about collective memory. You know, every year on 9/11, whoever is the president gives a speech repeating the typical story, the narrative that has been created and sustained since the attacks, as to why this country was attacked for our freedom and democracy. And never is there a mention of all of those communities, disproportionately Muslim, who have been harmed along the way. So what does it mean for us to create and collectively think about how we remember the last 20 plus years of the war on terror? Finally, when we think about abolishing the war on terror, we have to know exactly what it is. It seems like a very basic question if we were to ask each other, what is the war on terror? But the United States government has managed to reduce the war to something that is just happening overseas, that it's just about militarism and warfare abroad. That it's not about all these tentacles that have been deeply entrenched into the ways in which we live our daily lives. So our panelists today will each tackle a piece of the war on terror. And the way it's laid out is through this taxonomy that I wrote about in my book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. And the taxonomy I created was meant to sort of capture all of the most, I would say, critical and devastating elements of the War on Terror. So that includes militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. We don't have anyone today who's explicitly talking about immigration, but obviously this will come up throughout our discussion, as many of these forms of violence are intertwined. So I'm really excited to be with all of the panelists. Grateful to Huda Katabi for moderating, and grateful to all of you who are tuning in to listen to and think about what the legacy of the War on Terror is. And before I hand it back over, I want to quickly show you some of the images on the timeline. And you can now view the timeline for anyone who is interested by going to shatteringjustice.org. Okay. Let me pull it up 1 second. I think it's pulling the wrong screen. Hold on 1 second. Okay. Okay, now if we can't get it to work just now, we can also show it at a later period point during the panel.
We can also encourage everyone to go to the website where they're at right now and explore while people are talking. I'm a visual learner, so whatever works for you.
Okay, I just was able to pull it up. Can you all see this?
Yes. Amazing.
Awesome. So this is a layout of what the exhibit looks like. It is also a physical exhibit, which we have featured at various events, primarily in the DC area. And if you look at the bottom, the timeline as it stands right now goes from 2001 to 2021. So it is a work in progress. And obviously, as the War on Terror continues, we intend to add more to the timeline. But as you briefly saw in the video, what the timeline entails is a series of pictures, images, depicting some of the violence that has happened in each of the years. And you can see what's documented and noted on the left-hand side in the images is described on the right-hand side. So you can click down and get a description, for example, of what the National Special Entry Exit Registration System was. So this is meant to be a robust political educational tool meant to connect us, right, again, from 2001 to 2021, and as we continue to build this out, to continue to map the War on Terror. We encourage you to use this timeline in creative ways, including bringing it to your communities and thinking about how the war on terror has manifested in your communities, in your schools, in your masajid, wherever it is. And thinking about what does it mean for us to understand this history and legacy, and in doing so, how we can dismantle the war on terror. So I'll just scroll through a couple more of the images, and then I will turn it over to the panelists for our discussion. And again, if you're just tuning in, the link to this exhibit is shatteringjustice.org.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hilal. It's so beautiful and such an important resource for collective memory. And also, the illustrations are gorgeous. Like, I just feel like sometimes the Muslim community isn't really on the whole graphic design thing if you've looked at any mosque logo or lack thereof. So also thank you for centering art and working with such talented artists to like really visualize in such beautiful ways this timeline. Amazing. So we're going to start with one quick introductory question for all of the panelists to answer, and then we'll kind of get into a little bit more specifics. So as the war on terror has gone unabated over the last 2 decades and counting, can you each talk a little bit about how the United States has fought the war, and if or how this has changed throughout your perspective, research, or focus areas? Sophia, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so, you know, the federal terrorism prosecutions have evolved over time, right? We've seen 3 or 4 evolutions of how the government brings these prosecutions, but the one constant in how, in all of those kinds of cases, is the government's reliance and use of Islamophobia and racism to secure those convictions. So what we saw at the beginning, you know, was this targeting of community leaders, right? The Holy Land Five, Samuel Aryan, the largest Muslim charity in the country, and their leaders, and that was very traumatic, really, for the entire Muslim community. It had mass involvement and support, community support, and interest, and they went after several leaders. So that drew a lot of attention, a lot of negative attention as well for the government. And so then what we saw was them backing off after those cases from the leaders and going for other targets where they could more easily expand these abusive practices, right? So, you know, their classified information procedures, this sentencing, everything that happens in these cases that's unique to federal terrorism prosecutions, has their attempts to expand this have been happening essentially in the dark. MLFA represents these cases, but, you know, we saw them focusing on individuals that in entrapment cases that wanted to travel in foreign conflicts. We saw escalation with the FBI targeting family members of individuals that had been charged or involved in US-based events with you know, some significant pushback there. And then the latest iteration, what we've really seen in the last 10 years, has been this move to social media and online criminalization of Muslim political and religious speech. That's been a significant change that we've seen in the last 10 years, and where we see most of these cases coming from. And that's targeted often at very young people, vulnerable people with mental health issues. So that's a significant evolution we've seen recently. But again, the constant in all of them throughout has been this reliance on racist, Islamophobic tropes to secure these convictions.
Thank you. Marcel, would you like to go next? And then Nicole and Dr. Hill.
Yeah, thank you so much. In the context of war and military occupation abroad in Muslim majority countries, we look at the war and occupation that happened in Afghanistan for just under 20 years that sort of jump-started, I think, what we think about the wars, mostly because of the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. Since then, the United States has had military operations in about 78 to 80 countries around the world on the guise of counterterrorism. Um, Things that have changed important to have the context right before preceding the initiation of the war on terror, but very much carried out through is like the utilization of certain directives, such as like the authorization of the authorization of military forces in action. And so this authorization has helped to circumvent a lot of different checks and balances in order for the United States military to conduct operations abroad. This was initiated first in Afghanistan post 9/11, and then this is the same authorization that was used for the invasion of Iraq. And this has continued to be one of the tools that the United States military industrial complex uses in order to justify its continuous use of action and occupation of these countries for as long as it has done that. In the context of Afghanistan, what's very interesting to note in this context is that the history of Afghanistan itself before 9/11 was rooted in US presence in a very coveted manner, right? So during the Cold War, while the United States did not have direct military action inside the country of Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War and also during the times of the Civil War, it has a presence by using private and secretive channels to be able to continue engaging militarily and to continue perpetuating its interests, arming different various resistance groups, and still having a lot of influence in the destabilization of Afghanistan, which carried in the 2001 context, using a lot of these different tactics, but definitely increasing in a way that we have seen, especially through the use of defense contractors, right? So the war on terror is what's so incredibly telling, especially in terms of the spending and the way in which the United States government has continued to enact, right, all of its operations, not just in Afghanistan, but in so many other regions and countries, is the privatization of the war, the ability to gain such a financial incentive for so many stakeholders, mostly private defense contractors and entities who are profiting, right, from this continuous occupation. And so this is not only a militarism action, but it's a money-making industry in and of its own. I mean, $14 trillion has been spent by the Pentagon in the last 20 years, half of which has been going to defense contractors. And so you see this perpetuation of destabilization that continues to profit a very specific class of people and political interests stemming from the United States as part of the war on terror and a lot of the directives that happened through that. And so one of the last things to maybe go or to basically finish up on this topic point is that the impacts are immensely felt. The impacts are so direct. I mean, you're talking about over 4.5 million individuals directly impacted, a death toll from direct and indirect impacts of the war. Over 40 million more have been displaced, and the intergenerational impacts that we're being felt, it's going to surmount as the war on terror continues on.
Nicole, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks. So the US's current approach to surveillance is really the result of a couple of different global war on terror shifts over the last 10 or 15 years. We know that after September 11th, there was this enormous crackdown on Arab and Muslim communities through tactics like FBI stings, coercive policing, and blanket surveillance. And so this was a continuation and also intensification of prior anti-Muslim policing. Folks might remember the 2007 troop surge in Iraq. This was sort of an utter military failure, but it led to this counterinsurgency turn in the global war on terror. So this winning of hearts and minds approach. And so people might remember seeing photos of US soldiers playing soccer with Iraqi kids and passing out coloring books. So this was about winning local support for the war and also gaining local knowledge to refine its military tactics. So this mixing of hard and soft power. Within the United States, we also saw this sort of growing concern around so-called homegrown terrorists, particularly with the rise of ISIS. This really came in 2012, 2013, when ISIS was rising, and also you had the Boston Marathon bombing. And of course, throughout this first decade of the war on terror, we saw consistent resistance to all forms of the global war on terror, both domestically and globally. So this counterinsurgency turn in the global war on terror, the fear of a so-called homegrown terrorist, combined with resistance to anti-Muslim policing, led to the creation of a more liberal domestic war on terror strategy, again, mixing hard and soft power. And this was done through a program called Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE, with the intention of ostensibly providing a community-driven, race-conscious national security approach by offering targeted communities a seat at the counterterrorism table. So this approach assumes that there's a linear so-called terrorist radicalization process that comes with observable, identifiable signs like praying 5 times a day and expressing outrage over US foreign policy. Like, it's an explicitly anti-Muslim, anti-Arab program. And so given this assumption of this radicalization process, CVE calls on community members, teachers, therapists, coaches, social workers, and others to identify and report potential terrorists through their everyday work with young people. So we see a couple of major shifts in the domestic war on terror with the rise of CVE. So the first is this turn to people-powered surveillance, such that the security state can reach deeper into the most intimate spaces of everyday life. So this is not just big data or high-tech surveillance, it's people-powered surveillance. And the second major shift really is this use of liberal narratives to frame new security initiatives as a progressive alternative to previous anti-terrorism approaches like stings, which of course have never stopped in the midst of this public retooling. So the domestic war on terror will continue to morph, and we need to be skeptical of this co-optation of liberal or even radical language to sell these new tools of surveillance. And then the last thing I want to note is that today's anti-terrorism approaches are grounded in anti-Palestinian racism that organized the very first terrorism laws in the United States after the 1967 war. And we see this sort of resurgence of these legal tools on college campuses today.
So I think one thing I want to start with, is a quote from George Orwell, who says, "The object of torture is torture." And the reason I start with this quote is because, when the 9/11 attacks first happened, and President Bush and his administration were laying out sort of the purview of the war on terror and eventually finding ways to sanction and condone torture, they sold everyone the idea that torture was necessary to get information to prevent future attacks, which we know is not true. Torture is not an effective method. And the point of torture, again, is just for the sake of torture. It's to dehumanize people. Torture has been a tactic that has been used extensively in the war on terror. It started in terms of sort of looking at the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure that existed, right? So, for example, memos in 2002 from Alberto Gonzalez, who argued that those detained as war on terror prisoners should be considered as enemy combatants and therefore not entitled to Geneva protections, which essentially meant that they could be tortured. Another memo written by John Yoo argued that in order for something to rise to the level of torture, it had to result in organ failure or death. Of course, we can assume, right, that there's a reason why particular groups are subjected to this kind of violence. And it's because of the sheer dehumanization, right, that the United States government has created and has pushed of Muslim communities. And it's a cyclical process, right? Because when you dehumanize people and then you see them in a dehumanized state, it perpetuates how they're perceived. So not only has torture happened at Guantanamo Bay, it was also used in the CIA's rendition, detention, and interrogation program that ran from 2002 to 2009. There was an entire report produced about the CIA's torture program that was produced by the Senate Intelligence Committee. The report is about 500 plus pages as far as the declassified version goes, and the classified version is 6,000 pages. And the little that we can glean from the torture report, the declassified version, describes the most horrific acts of violence. Prisoners having their eyes pulled out, prisoners made to sit in freezing cold cells. There's a lot of abuses, a lot of torture that has occurred. And I should have said trigger warning because it is extremely disturbing. While the United States claims it doesn't torture, and has since tried to say that those days are sort of more or less over, we have to think about, what does torture actually mean, right? When people are detained indefinitely in places like Guantanamo, with no hope of ever leaving the prison, with no charges or conviction, that should obviously be considered torture. Indefinite detention is torture. We also should think about, as I mentioned, the Abu Ghraib trials we opened, the fact that there is zero accountability for torture. So, for example, many of the men who have been transferred out of Guantanamo suffer a lot of violence, right? Suffer from PTSD, suffer because they're sent to third-party countries where they have no hope of resuming any semblance of a normal life. And so this country has been very committed to torture. And every time they release a statement, there's June 26th is the UN Day in support of victims of torture. Every year, the US government releases a statement condemning other countries for torturing and saying how they support survivors of torture, never mentioning, of course, that this country has been deeply embedded in torture, not just after 9/11, but long before 9/11. And it's just really important when we think about accountability. When Obama became president, he said it's important for us we have to look forwards and not backwards. And now we see with Abu Ghraib, there's zero accountability for the senior administration officials who condoned and facilitated the context right for torture. So what does it mean for survivors and victims to not have any access to justice after they've been tortured? So if I impart anything in this particular section, I would just say that when people say that the United States does not torture, obviously that's false. And we should never say at this point that it is a stain on this country, because it is not a stain, because this country's whole history is of violence and bloodshed and torture and abuse. And so it's important for us to keep that in perspective.
Thank you so much. More like the United States is a stain on the whole world. Thank you all for your beautiful insights, and I think it's very clear how expansive the war on terror is, and yet how related and interconnected all of the focus areas that you touched on. I think thinking about like this timeline and the exhibition, were there any particular images or time periods or events that particularly stuck with you? And can you talk a little bit about why?
I'll go first. All right. So I think for me, one that really stood out was the image from 2009A. I don't know if somebody can bring that up, but in that image, they talked about the Holy Land 5 case. Now, most Muslims, at least not the youngest ones, but most Muslims have heard of that case. It was where the largest charity in the United States, the Muslim charity, the Holy Land Foundation, the heads of that organization were charged with providing material support to Hamas and convicted. And the way that trial was carried out, the evidence that was brought in, the total silencing of those men, it really it was horrible for the community. If you look at this image, you see all these people in the background holding up signs like "Charity's not a crime," "I need my dad back." All of the men are gagged. This image stood out to me because I felt like it really captured what came out of that case. These men are all gagged because their voices were completely silenced in this. These were great people that were, raising a lot of money. Both sides admitted in the trial that they were providing humanitarian aid to the most in need in Gaza for children. They admitted that, the government admitted that. The way that they convicted them of providing material support was they had an anonymous Israeli intelligence agent say that the Palestine side that was distributing the funds that were raised here, that there was a member on that committee that was a member of Hamas. The US had been giving aid to the same committee. They said they had never heard that. All the countries that were providing aid to the same place, none of them had ever heard that before. It only came from this one anonymous agent. And that trumped everything else, all the other evidence. And so in that image, where you see this outrage, the charity's not a crime, the silencing, I thought it did a great job of encapsulating what the takeaway was for the Muslim community from that case. To this day, people are afraid to donate to humanitarian causes. They're afraid to speak out and say things. We get so many calls right now on what's happening in Gaza. People that, can I donate to help my friend's family flee? And they're terrified of it, right? So, this has had a long-lasting impact. That image did a really good job in that case. I think picking that case for the timeline, there have been hundreds, but that one was critical. And we feel the repercussions of it till now. I think it's on the top of everyone's mind right now, because that was one of the biggest Hamas-related cases, and it was related directly to humanitarian aid in Gaza, which I think is something everyone is dealing with now. Everyone is donating for.
If I could go next, it's so hard personally for me to pinpoint one thing that stands out, just because I first of all commend just the creation of this project, because it's hard to think what can you cover first. That's actually very, very telling for me. And it's so interesting to see in which there's such a juxtapose in the way in which war is fought abroad and the war is coming back and fought at home, right? And so if I think about pivotal timeframes of my particular life, I was personally quite young, in the start of actual wars abroad in 2001, 2003. But as I've grown up to think about how formative my experience has been, one as an Afghan American and a Muslim American, in the systems of just education, systems of exposure to, the growing digitalization of information and social media and all of that, and how these tools have only gained so much stronger. And I, as a citizen, have sort of grown within these systems. And so to take a step is so incredibly it's such a sobering moment for me to sort of see that timeline, to reckon with the things that I've understood most, which tends to be from the work that I've done, is the harms that have happened abroad, but also how much have I been impacted here in complacency in terms of the way in which surveillance just naturally works with social media with community members who've been impacted, allied community members who've been impacted across the United States, as a direct, consistent narrative and strategy for the war on terror to continue on and at home and of course abroad.
Yeah, I think similarly for me, the 2001 to 2005 period was really impactful. Just thinking about, I teach at a university, and my youngest students were born in 2005. And so, September 11th, they weren't alive for, they have no memory of. They largely don't know what Abu Ghraib was. And what they do know is taught in history books. And so for me, it was, I think the imagery is actually really impactful in both registering a different story and also showing sort of the depth of impact of the war on terror. So for me, it's something, I know we've spoken so much about the artwork, but the artwork is actually really powerful in communicating that this wasn't just like something that happened, but it had really deep and long-lasting effects and continues to have long-lasting effects on communities. And so for me, that was one of the more powerful ways of communicating a counter narrative to young people who have only been taught, we do this for national security, we do this because there are terrorists, and really just challenging that narrative.
So I think for me, they're all extremely poignant pictures, and, they communicate a lot of pain. But I come back to 2001, and in particular, the part of the image that's towards the bottom, where this woman has her hands over her ears. And, the reason that stands out to me, I hope you guys can see it. Can you guys see the image?
Yes.
Okay. Is just in the way that the war on terror has continued. And it feels like what's being communicated there is that there's really like nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to go. And, when the United States told us, right, the government said we had to invade Iraq and Afghanistan, it was as if it was going to be, something bound by time, that it wasn't going to be an indefinite length of time. And so this is just, to me, just sort of one of the more poignant images because of the ways, it just communicates like the longevity of the violence and how, Muslims continue to suffer so many years after the launch of the war on terror.
Yeah, thank you for that. And related also to all of these issues of just like the intensity of how this impacted, the United States, but also so many individual stories that are lost in this, like so much intimacy that many of us as Muslims have with the war on terror, and even the ways that, I think especially for the youth, the Gen Zs, and those of us who were very young when 9/11 happened and the war on terror started, that we don't actually know a world that is not the war on terror. We grew up in this world, and it's hard to actually understand what an alternative world could look like. And so I think just given the extent of the harm, the trauma, and also just the ongoing nature of the violence and the dehumanization of the war on terror, what do each of you think that justice, this like very easy question, justice and accountability look like on behalf of Muslims or for Muslims and other communities, Black Muslims, non-Muslim Black people, Indigenous people, people abroad, people domestically, protesters, Palestinians? Like there's so many layers of just intersection here of like harm. So if you don't have an answer of like what justice looks like, what would be one step toward that?
All right, I'll go first again. I think, for federal terrorism prosecutions and the sort of the fallout that comes from these. I think, so MLFA recently, we just had it's a historic win, and it's the first successful malicious prosecution case against the FBI in one of these terrorism prosecutions. So it's the first time that the FBI is being held solely liable for these abusive practices, and that's critical. The damages portion of this is coming up in a few months, but we're hoping to get a pretty significant award. But in terms of the justice and accountability part of it, we'd want to see hundreds of those. There's a lot there in all of these cases. So much has already been lost, right? So what we have seen in some other, very pretty discriminatory government, federal, prosecution tactics, we see these mass reforms that happen decades too late, but mass sentencing reforms, awards, and then there really needs to be, none of this will change really unless there's a public reckoning with what has happened, right? And in order to do that, everything from these cases, because so much of it is classified and is under lock and key, and very little of it gets out. If the case doesn't go to trial, all of the terrible things that they did in that prosecution gets to stay secret. And that's largely why I think society has just let this sort of progress, is it's this thing happening in the dark to a minority. So until there's this massive declassification of everything that the government does, how they've treated these people, and we've had that reckoning and realization of how wrong that is, I don't really think there's going to be much change or true justice and accountability for that. So I think we would have to start there.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to sort of add to that in the sense that, to sort of echo the sort of families that I've supported around terrorism prosecutions have talked about how much they've lost in terms of like their own connection to community, the sort of stigma that continuously follows them, and understanding that probably the state isn't going to provide the forms of like transformative justice that folks are looking for and deserve. And so to think about what would a sort of abolitionist or transformative justice approach that's something that's community driven. So how do we sort of as communities acknowledge the harm that was done, recognize that it was harm, that it happened, and how do we provide pathways for people to find some sense of healing and justice that's possible, whether that's like providing support and resources for people who are experiencing PTSD, who've been alienated by their communities, like what work do we need to do within ourselves to not stigmatize and alienate people who have been charged or convicted of terrorism-related crimes. And so to sort of not give the state all of the power to be the pathway towards justice, and to really think about what work do we need to do in response to the harm that's done, and also how do we try to get at the root causes of both state violence, like how do we challenge the root causes of state violence, and how do we also get at the root causes of the thing that we call political violence, right? So how do we get at the root of settler colonialism in Palestine, right? And so to think both like very community oriented and also like transnationally expansively in a sort of decolonial, anti-colonial kind of way, and to hold both those things together.
I'll bring up some things in terms of a justice and reparations standpoints and demands to the state. As like project coordinator for Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, some of the work that we are doing right now is to try to hold the state accountable for what's happened in Afghanistan over the 20 years. And as part of that, wanting policy reforms like the passage of the Afghan Adjustment Act, which provides pathways, which provides safety and security and refuge for Afghans at risk who have been left behind and put back into the hands of a very oppressive entity that now tries to maintain control of Afghanistan, to uphold so many of the failed promises that the United States tried to position itself as protectors of and claim to uphold. And so we we require that level of accountability. We also have a situation in which, every day people in Afghanistan right now are being hurt by a humanitarian and economic crisis that's been perpetrated by so many harms that's happened over the 20 years. And so a call for the return of the funds that rightfully belong in the hands of the Afghan people. If you know of the case of the Afghan frozen funds, there's been signaling by government officials and by administration to give that funding, to families who are lobbying for it, who are families of victims of 9/11, right? But to understand that actually has a harm of our own community when those assets that rightfully belong to people are also still intertwined in this narrative of the 9/11, right? In which the people in Afghanistan had no direct causes, and that still continues to perpetuate a lot of those narrative harms. And so from a community perspective, to be able to invest, to demand direct investment within our communities, and so that we can also have a grassroots approach to healing, right, to building safe spaces for our community to tell our stories very effectively, to support, the influx, at least within the Afghan community, the influx of the arrivals of people who have been displaced, right? To have immigration reforms and policies that don't continue to criminalize our people trying to seek safety and refuge in the United States as a direct impact of the displacement that the war on terror has caused, right? And so we look at that from a two-pronged perspective of the harms the state has done. And there's so much that the local communities, states, counties, neighborhoods could do to welcome directly impacted people and to give us the rightful spaces that we need in order to to undo those harms and to get towards that healing as a direct result of those issues that U.S. militarism has caused.
I really appreciate what everyone has said so far, and I think one of the most important things, I think Nicole brought this up around not necessarily looking to the state for justice. When I was attending the trial for the Abu Ghraib survivors, one of the survivors who testified at the hearing was told in response by the corporation's attorney that the government didn't have any record of him being interrogated. And so obviously the implication there was that the government was inherently more trustworthy, and of course the government would never lie or conceal information about the interrogation and torture of someone at Abu Ghraib prison. And so when I think about sort of justice in that context, I think for us, it's about uplifting the stories of survivors. In the case of Guantanamo, for example, there's been numerous survivors who, once transferred out of the prison, actually, and some wrote while they were in prison, have written books, articles that really detail their experiences. And so uplifting those as direct challenges to the state's narrative, right? Because the state's narrative has constructed them as, monsters, they're evil, right? They're terroristic. And all of these people are leaving with the stigma of terrorism on their backs. So for us, I think it's, those of us who aren't survivors, really uplifting their stories, I think is really critical. Also bringing them into community. I mean, I've been doing work on Guantanamo for many, many, many years. And it's often been one of the issues that the Muslim community does not want to touch. And I recognize, of course, that there's a plethora of issues that are impacting the Muslim community. And, it's not solely because of that, but at the same time, right, we, I think, have sort of gravitated towards some of the easier cases, right? Some of the cases where, Muslims are constructed as innocent, and we're not willing to really challenge and deconstruct, whether it's in the federal terrorism prosecutions in Guantanamo, CIA, really those cases in which Muslims had been constructed as like the worst of the worst, right? And so how do we help bring justice to those individuals outside of the state? So I think it is like, where do we look for justice? And I think one specific, intervention that Muslim Counterpublics Lab has been a part of is co-establishing a Guantanamo Survivors Fund with No More Guantanamo's Witness Against Torture and organization called HEART and a survivor named Mansour Adaifi. And so we provide small grants to survivors who have been transferred out of Guantanamo, but who have mostly been abandoned by the US government. And, of course, the idea there is that, we're not going to wait for the administration or any administration to give these survivors what's due to them. And so how do we step up as a community of concerned individuals to make sure that they get their justice?
Thank you. Maybe I just heard what I want to hear, but I just heard the US empire has to fall. I think I heard that somewhere in there. As the only form of justice. Amazing. And I think what's interesting is that all of your responses to that question, actually, like what justice looks like, touches so much on storytelling and collective memory. So can you expand a little bit on like maybe generally what are some of those like tangible interventions that you've used to challenge state violence? What are some wins? We love some wins. And what is the role of us, and some of your work that you've been doing that you have been seeing like success in terms of either building community power, watching back, the stories, and how does that sort of play out as an intervention against state violence?
I see I got tagged in. I guess I was thinking about this question in terms of building movement power, building solidarity across different groups. So like, I think Shattering Justice provides a way in for people who are not familiar or directly impacted by the global war on terror, but for whom may have been or could be at one point marked as a potential terrorist. So I'm thinking about the No DAPL water protectors. I'm thinking about the No Cop City protesters, Black Lives Matter, being cast as Black identity extremists. So I feel like one of the retellings of the global war on terror is that this is a Muslim and Arab experience and also is interconnected with other forms of police violence, war and empire. And so I think the coalition building that has happened as a result of recognizing that like the Chicago Police Department tortured Black Chicagoans and also those same police officers tortured people in Guantanamo as a narrative that allows for people to see the interconnections and therefore build solidarity in ways that are aimed at ending state violence. And so I think that has been one of the most powerful ways I've seen these sort of counter stories move in spaces that might not otherwise be talking about the global war on terror or be talking about anti-Muslim racism or anti-Muslim policing. And so I think it's bringing people into the conversation and into the struggle that for me has been, as a sort of non-Muslim, non-Arab person, has been really powerful to see.
My question to that, I mean, for me, I think it's super critical to have historical and collective memory that's rooted very authentically, very transparently, and very graciously within our own communities, that it comes from our people who are most impacted, whether here or abroad, or even with our connection points with this global diaspora. It's so important that we preserve these stories because there's like a quote, and I hope I don't take it away from anyone else who might want to mention it, was this quote that says like all wars are fought twice, the first time in the battlefield and the second time in memory. And so even in the context of like right now, it's astounding to see, at the very least in one example, with the war and occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years, there's the Afghanistan War Commission. That's a congressional mandate that's going on right now. It's a 3-year mandate. And you look at these types of projects with as a community organizer with so much concern and skepticism because, as a community member, I don't want the memory of this occupation and war to be a continuous muffling and washing of so many of the failures and so many of the harms that have been produced in this, right? And so we need to have a community like centered response right, to these types of mandates in which the institution will try to clean its hands of those harms, right? That there are aspects that were good about this occupation of Afghanistan or war, right? Or that the withdrawal was only bad. But really the position that needs to be reaffirmed is war is always, always bad, right? And so to collect those stories is a way for us to continuously ensure that our histories are not going to be told by, only a certain handful group of people. And I think that one of the ways that we can do this as a community is to build spaces that are safe and that enable for voices to be shared and heard out. And so there's like, of course, different methods, right? We can do digital archiving. I mean, Afghans for a Better Tomorrow is what right now envisioning how can we ensure that at this moment that those 20 years don't get stuck in these lost obscure timelines, right? And so how could we create structures in which we provide space for power building and grassroots mobilization and building capacity and empowering within our own communities, just generations of so many aspects of ourselves that that aren't going to be again obscured throughout history, and hopefully to use these tools as a way to support the memorialization of our other impacted community members, right? And so there's so many intersections of our causes and of our issues and the things that have really attempted to oppress all of our voices as a community, but coming in just solely from an African American perspective, the thing that I feel like I can contribute most to is to empower at least one aspect of the community here. And so, that's why it's super important to me on that thing. Digital timelines like MCL, these timelines are like open source. These are available. These can be used in so many academic settings and political education and community organizing. I mean, to have information out, I think is a form of potential power, right? And so, there's like the whole kinetic power thing, like what you need to do is to have that foundation at first of information that's accessible and it's not been muddled by, by the state and by institutions that continue to try to keep us down. And from there, to empower and enable communities to use that information to further usage to build and continue empowering themselves.
Yeah, I think we're all sort of in agreement here on the collective memories. We need the community to have a sort of general acceptance that everyone is responsible for building their understanding and historical knowledge of the war on terror's impact on not just our community, but it has impacts for all of society, right? We see the expansion of these laws, these types of prosecutions to every other group now, including, in the January 6th cases. They were suddenly really upset about the terrorism enhancement and all of these, FBI stings, and they were livid about it. I think even the FBI hated it because now they're investigating, their brother-in-law and their buddy from college, and so it affects everyone. No one's happy about this when it affects them. So expanding that collective memory to establishing community with everyone, building this idea that if they're doing it to us now and have been for 20 years, but we've already seen it expanded in all these different ways. And so it's sort of everyone's responsibility to be mindful of it. What other interventions? So, I could actually see, in court, in trial, you're dealing with the just average middle American is your juror. And so we do a lot of these rudimentary small timelines or, this kind of storytelling to tell very complex long-term narratives to jurors. So I actually think Maha and, with the Muslim Counterpublics Lab, this timeline is really effective because it's accessible to everyone on any level. The pictures make it very easy to understand for younger or less sophisticated audiences. And then there's details there for people that really want to tell a detailed story. So I think having timelines like this for even all the micro aspects of it, I'm thinking for me specifically, it's very difficult to get federal judges. Oftentimes it's their first terrorism case to understand why everything doesn't need to be classified. There's always this hysteria from the FBI that, no, everything's classified. You can't look at the evidence. And so it takes, that a year or two over that time to educate the judge on like, no, you're in charge. You decide what's classified and you can do this. But I think having these kinds of timelines is something that maybe we can build as a community. And echoing what Nicole said earlier, building these coalitions with groups that have been going through this a lot longer than us. We can learn a lot from the Black Civil Rights Movement and COINTELPRO, and how much, community knowledge that they have, and they make the responsibility of everyone in their community. The Muslim community needs to do that as well.
So I think primarily two things. One, I just, published an op-ed in Truthout about the Abu Ghraib trial, and I know I keep bringing it up. But there's this quote from a Spanish-American philosopher who said, George Santayana, that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And what I write towards the end is that the United States actually actively and intentionally, right, wants people to forget the history so it can be repeated. It's not about avoiding repetition, right? So I think what that means for communities that are targeted is that we continue to tell our stories. And I think the timeline is one piece of that, right? Especially because of how robust the narrative infrastructure demonizing Muslims really is. It's important for us to have these counter stories. And I think there hasn't been a lot of spaces where we can do that. And I think the timeline is also important because it just, as others have said, the images are so visceral and they really communicate a sort of a pain on a very emotional level. And it, I think, articulates how horrible this whole war on terror has been. And then the other thing is, there's this proverb, right, that says, until the lion learns to write, the story, every story will glorify the hunter, right? And I think probably a lot of you have heard that quote. And it really speaks to another piece of the work that MCL is doing, which is around narrative power, including, we just concluded a Muslim Narrative Power Fellowship and are also working generally in this space to produce thought leadership. So really trying to intervene in these problematic narratives, because we've all seen what happens, right? When the media and the government are not challenged by the narratives that they continue to spew. I mean, I don't think we need to look any further right now, right, than what's happening with Israel's genocide of Palestinians to know how important it is that we present a formidable force to challenge these narratives and really challenge the status quo in terms of the assumptions that have allowed these narratives to thrive.
Absolutely. And thank you all so much. I'm going to turn to one question. There are two questions that are related, one a little bit more specific version of it, but Hannah asks, how do we as Muslims ensure that our fellow Muslims don't work within the systems that oppress them, i.e. join the military, work as translators, join the FBI, CIA, I'll add, become a cop. So yeah, anybody have any thoughts on this important question?
I can start with an answer and then others can follow. I think this is a really important question. And, we actually had an event in February called At the Table and on the Menu, Respectability Politics during Genocidal Times. And I think it spoke directly to that issue. I think one of the things that needs to be done is, as many of us organizations and individuals combat external Islamophobia, we also need to look inwards and challenge internalized Islamophobia and think about the ways in which, Muslims as a community have embraced these problematic ideas about how we're disproportionately, we disproportionately commit acts of terrorism, we're inherently violent, angry, etc. And unfortunately, those are the perceptions that some Muslims in our community have. I also think, at a certain point, we have to acknowledge that not everyone is working towards the same goal, right? Not everyone is working towards liberation. collective liberation or anything even short of that. And that some people are just vested in their own careers and proximity to power. But, that said, I think, to me, as someone who's invested in this kind of work, especially internalized Islamophobia, I mean, I think there's a threshold. So I think we can push back a little bit on people that are working in these spaces and try to engage with them. But after a certain point, I mean, I think you kind of know where people stand. For example, there are a lot of Muslims working in government now, for example, in the State Department specifically. And all of those people who have maintained their position in spite of the genocide, and who continue to maintain that they're making a difference when there's really no evidence that that's happening, I think we need to put pressure on those individuals and really underscore, especially for those organizations and individuals that claim to be representing the Muslim community, that they're really not supposed to or should not be allowed to go into those spaces on that basis. And that if they do, and when they do, they have to know that they are harming the Muslim community. It's not just about them. They are literally causing harm and violence to befall the Muslim community in certain positions. And so, I think we need to challenge them on that, and then also just accept that there's going to be a divergence of strategy, and then do what we have to do in order to sort of silence the strategies that are being used that are allowing for the perpetuation of violence by our own community members.
Yeah, I had an answer just to add to that, echo everything Maha is saying. I see the same thing. We see it a lot actually in the legal profession where Muslim attorneys, that are recruited, hired by the government, FBI, that they're celebrated, or DHS, they're glorified, revered. That's seen as a very, that's proximity to power, successful, everything that Maha said. But the other side of it is, who else is working in that space and what could we do to prevent them? And what I see in a lot of my cases is the informants, right? FBI informants. And oftentimes, most of the time, they are not people that willingly went and signed up. These are people that were trying to avoid prosecution, trying to avoid being deported, and the FBI targets these individuals. They're vulnerable. So, I think people with lots of bankruptcies, fraud, things like that could be charged themselves. And so there's this pressure to inform and even entrap other Muslims. People in compromised immigration situations, they feel a lot of pressure. They often also feel a lot of guilt, So I think, how do we prevent those people? Because that's really where a lot of the problems come from for the community. And I think that is, being aware that that's a problem and looking out for each other, right? Reaching out to people, building awareness of this as a problem. We've gotten so many calls from individuals that have been in these situations for some time, and then they call an attorney for the first time and are shocked to find out they don't have to do this, that they have other options, that they don't, that they have rights in these situations. So I think building awareness of this, reaching out and helping people that you think may be in compromise, and building this sort of legal knowledge, and even just knowledge that and empowerment that you can reach out to an attorney, you have rights. Just doing that would do so much, I think, to prevent a lot of the biggest problems we have in that area.
It switched back to me, so I'm assuming no one else has further comments. Great. There's another question by Miriam in the chat that I think is a great one. I'm also, if it's okay, Miriam, I'm going to add a little bit just because we may not be able to answer from a legal perspective, but the question is, in a public gathering, like in a masjid, if they ask if there are any informants present in the meeting, is it legally obligatory on them? Are they obliged to identify themselves? If anybody has the legal answer to that, I'm happy to also answer that. But I think maybe to add, if there's a fear of having in Muslims in our Muslims in our masjids. I hope there are a lot of Muslims in our masjids, inshallah. If there's a fear of having informants, what an awful Freudian slip, in our masjids, maybe what are some tools or resources, things that we can think through, practices that we can incorporate in order to create community safety and masjid safety, to protect ourselves and be more resilient in the face of potential types of surveillance.
Yes, I'll just jump in here really quick. They don't have to confirm anything to you. So it's one of the ironies in dealing with law enforcement is you cannot lie to them at all. You cannot even just slightly fudge your answer, but they can absolutely lie to you, and they often do. They will, and especially an informant, the entire purpose in that role is to not reveal who they are, right? And so they will often lie. Oftentimes, we've had cases where they are back and forth. The client is back and forth talking to an informant, discussing how careful they need to be because the FBI is everywhere, and you could be talking to an informant, getting that advice from an informant. So they don't need to do that. In terms of how do we be careful, I think going back to what I said earlier, educating the community on just the cases. What do the cases actually look like? How does this show up? How does this drag people over the line in the law? What to do if you see or hear problematic things from someone. If you have concerns about someone and you don't want to just, take matters into your hands, or you're worried about how it's going to be, reach out to an attorney with an experience in the area. They can give you advice. And if you think, that it's an informant and they're being inflammatory, crossing the line, trying to get someone in trouble, you can, through your attorney, even report that person. But just knowledge is power, right? So just learning about it, I think, is important.
Anyone else have anything they'd like to add? No. Well, we're coming up at the very end. I'll ask one final question, unless there are any other comments that come up, which is, what is our role in empire? As all of us, as Muslims, so much of our work, is global, is transnational. And at the end of the day, there's also a responsibility for us living in the heart of empire. What does that look like for us? And what are ways that we can practice that responsibility today, tomorrow, and hold each other accountable in that?
Okay, I can start us off. So given that I live actually directly in the heart of empire in Washington, D.C., and like literally a block from the Pentagon, I think it's imperative that we continue to challenge the status quo. I mean, I think we're in the position where we really have to challenge the state and challenge the violence that's being inflicted by the state. I think, one of the cultural parts of this country that's, I think, really problematic is that, we're always taught that in order to have the lives that we do, that it necessarily involves the domination and exploitation of people around the globe. And we really need to dismantle and deconstruct and just get rid of that idea. And we need to understand how people in this country can and have to coexist with people in other countries on a basis of relationships that are equitable. And obviously this doesn't necessarily fall to us as individuals, but as individuals, organizations, and communities and societies, then what do we do, right? What do we do to challenge the status quo, right? Whether it's going to actions, protesting, right? Writing books, writing articles, building power in our communities, right? Making sure that we're not becoming acquiescent to the state. And I think, the last thing I'll say, tied into the question about not having Muslims work with oppressive systems, is to recognize acquiescence when it comes. So if the Biden administration, for example, invites you to a Eid party or a Ramadan iftar while they're committing or helping support the committing of genocide by Israel, you just don't go, right? The little things, the symbolic things, anything you can do to challenge empire and recognize, right, that empire is not about Republican or Democrat. Empire is about the foundation of this country, the violence that it's rooted in, and the violence that it will continue to be rooted in until we get, right, and obtain collective liberation.
Thank you so much. And I'll ask one final question. I know we're supposed to end in a minute, but we do have a good question from Madiha, who asks, how do mosque admin prevent our board from building relationships with the local government officials that further existing problematic structures of using Muslim communities for their political gain? So opportunism and sort of using identity politics in place of actual liberation politics. I don't know if anyone wants to answer that really quickly, and then we can close out.
So a thought I'm having here is, we get some of these complaints, and I know communities struggle with this. Also, just mosques inherently are often very poorly organized and not following all the regulations or best practices that not the typical nonprofit really should. There should be regular board turnover. There should be regular votes where the affected community can have some say in who's in charge, what's happening, what they are and are not engaging with. But the board, that these are their decisions, right? And so usually the community organizes and they reach out and they have meetings, express their concerns. I think doing that in an organized way and keeping things civil so everyone is still listened to and you don't get yourselves ignored is probably the best way to do that. And if you're on the right side, which it sounds like this in this case, absolutely, just raising the community support for that, having a petition or something signed for them, that can go a long way.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so very much. Thank you to Noha Bendawi, the tech extraordinaire behind the scenes with the super fast transitions. Thank you, each and every one of you, for taking time to be on this panel today, and also your extraordinary work fighting the good fight for all of us collectively and pushing us all forward towards liberatory work, inshallah. And a final just quick note as we close out is that sometimes these talks feel so overwhelming. It's all encompassing. The war on terror is everywhere. It affects, it's so, again, intimate in the ways that it impacts all of us. And I think with something that's expansive, that actually also creates so many opportunities for interventions. That means almost anywhere that you start, you can start hacking away at the war on terror, undoing the frameworks, and fighting for a more beautiful world for all of us. And I think in a moment like this one, with the genocide and protests happening across the country and around the world, there's ample opportunity to jump in whatever way feels comfortable for you, that feels like you're able to fight against the war on terror and all of its many vestiges and tentacles. So thank you all so much for your time and your evening, and for a more liberated world for all of us, inshallah.